Thank you so much, Amanda. Hi, everyone. I'm thrilled to be here today, and I'm excited to be speaking with Halimah DeLaine Prado. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me, Cesca. I appreciate it.
So you obviously have worked in Google's legal department for 14 years before becoming general counsel last year in August. During your tenure, you have had the misfortune/fortune of advising Google C-suite on everything from political issues like immigration to navigating the workforce through this pandemic to the critical movement that we're seeing now around social justice. So I'm hoping you can help us navigate the era that we live in now as the rules for engagement in politics and society have changed dramatically. But maybe let's take a quick step back and give us a little insight into how your own career path shaped the way you approach your new role.
Sure, it's a great question. I think part of what's gotten me to this role, and I think frankly what got me to Google generally, was a desire to actually counsel alongside and not just reactively to a client's given business need. I was really sort of struck with the notion that lawyers could be more than just sort of mere protectors, but in fact sort of enablers to help others architect a new tool. And I really wanted the notion of how sort of in the legal field, you could actually help sort of architect, if not support that type of innovation. And so moving out of sort of outside counsel and moving in-house was an opportunity to really sort of hone my skills and practice more of that sort of in the moment counseling and a little less of sort of just the damage control.
Right. So that sort of in the moment counseling seems to be very valuable right now. Companies like Google have taken a stand on national issues that might have been seen as too political in the past. One that is on a lot of people's minds right now is voting rights. Your company signed that New York Times, Washington Post full-page letter supporting voting rights and condemning legislation that restricts would hamper the ability to vote, essentially. What went into that choice, and how should companies think about whether to speak out on political issues today?
Sure. So, as we signed that letter, Google as a company is sort of deeply concerned about efforts to restrict voting at a local level. And to that end, outside of just that New York Times letter, we strongly supported the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. And we think our role, particularly as a company, should be to build products that actually help society. And sort of as a legal team, we're constantly sort of working with the business to not just sort of keep them kind of in tune and sort of in line with laws, but to actually think about the impact that that particular product has on the benefit of society. So what does that mean sort of in terms of voting? For years, and not just sort of this past sort of 2 or so years, we've worked with trusted organizations and we've built tools to provide users with authoritative resources on how to vote, when to vote, the sources and the like. So really anchoring back to our core company sort of principle of making information universally accessible and usable. And so I think our engagement, at least as it relates to sort of voting rights sources, anchors back to that company principle again and again. And we do that sort of on that issue and others. The notion being, where can we provide value and where could we provide that value and impact to society writ large, regardless of where you stand, and let's do it in a neutral and authoritative way.
Now, Google is obviously a very different place to work from a lot of other companies, right? And I hear you talking about finding the core principle instead of just the idea that it is all companies' responsibility to speak out on everything. Like if you're advising the C-suite of a company in a different industry or maybe in a different state, like how do you weigh the risks of speaking out, and what goes into the internal calculus for other general counsel?
I probably can't speak for all general counsel, but I think the sort of mantra that I kind of held to and that I would suggest others sort of do in their own practice is anchor yourself back to sort of the company's ultimate sort of business goals and principles. What is it that they intend to do? What is it sort of what's indicative of company culture? And then advise within that sort of scope. And so the notion being, if you in fact believe that the company should be creating sort of tools that have great societal impact, then you're evaluating and giving sort of advice, both in a legal context or any other business context, with that in mind. When you veer away from that, I think you tend to lack sort of, you lose your North Star, if you will. And I think it is critical for companies to sort of anchor back to that, not only so that sort of, I think for your employees, they have a clear sense of what they're working for and driving for, but to those sort of users of those products and services, they understand sort of your movements and your actions.
Another issue where Google is taking a stand is immigration. Google's filing a brief with other big tech companies like Amazon and Microsoft in a court case that seeks to end work visas for spouses of immigrants on H-1Bs. There are 90,000 of these H-4 visa holders. 90% of them are women. And Google wrote a blog post last week calling attention to the issue. We've written a lot about it. Can you give us kind of your outlook for the case, and how do you see that fitting into Google's broader engagement around social policy?
Sure. So I think, again, kind of going back to this notion of thinking about sort of how you as a company and what principles you hold dear, one of those principles is having a diverse workforce. Part of the ability to actually maintain that diverse workforce are visa programs like the one that's currently being challenged. Another aspect of a core company principle is creating accessibility, allowing for access for others. This particular sort of visa program, in fact, does that twofold. It not only does that in terms of the talent that it brings into the country to work on products for companies like Google and others, but specifically for spouses, particularly women, to have sort of an opportunity to sort of, participate in the workforce. That's sort of access at its best. And so in terms of finding an opportunity in which to, one, sort of protect and enhance and sort of support the rights of our workforce, as well as, to be perfectly honest, find an avenue in which a legal department can actually drive change on behalf of the company. This particular issue is one that is rife for our involvement. We feel rather strongly about it.
These are big, serious issues where obviously there's a wide range of opinion. How do you, even if it's a core principle of your company, how do you as a general counsel go about building consensus on an idea like this and then kind of keeping the rest of the table on the bus with you?
So I think a lot of it is one sort of, again, you anchor to the notion of here is our North Star. If our North Star is to actually say, for example, have a diverse workforce whose spouses or partners also have the ability to have a healthy and engaged sort of interaction in the workforce themselves, you explain how a given initiative might get you there, right? So draw that correlation to the project or initiative and the ultimate North Star. Now, that for the most part is sort of your biggest step with consensus. Then I think sort of particularly for lawyers, you need to be able to hear the concerns. What are the risks, both from a legal perspective? What are the business's worries about the impact that that initiative might have? And then what is your path to mitigation? Resolution. Now, not everything you identify is in fact resolvable. And so the question is whether or not you're willing to take that risk on. And that's where you get into the calculated sort of business decision. But the goal is to sort of lay bare all the possible sort of options, issues, and the like, and actually have a forward-looking plan to move forward, and then you assess. I will say, so I'll give a bit of the professional advice. Lawyers shouldn't be afraid to offer the recommendation, even if it is sort of a business-minded recommendation. You can say, I'm taking off my legal hat, but weighing the political landscape, weighing the legal issues, weighing all of these, here's our suggested approach from soup to nuts as to how to get that done.
That's great. Let's talk a little bit more about DEI broadly, both within Google and writ large in the legal community. Like, what changes are you pressing for that might help move the needle, and how should leaders approach DEI to be impactful?
It's a great question. And I think it's been a lot sort of in the minds of many sort of in the legal field. I think historically, particularly within legal, it has not been the most diverse or sustainably diverse profession. No fault of folks who have tried, but it really has sort of heightened to me just from my own personal kind of journey in the legal field to have a critical sort of what I will call soup to nuts or cradle to grave approach to DEI. And what I mean by that is it is not just working on representation within my own department, but it is thinking about the pipeline to representation. And so within Google specifically, we have offered a program for quite some time called the Legal Summer Institute, where we actually look towards and partner with law firms and their second year sort of summer associates, where they come to Google for 2 weeks and hear a bunch of content from lawyers and the like about an in-house profession. So not something that is sort of immediately sort of like relatable to them, but actually helping them sort of look to a second or third step in their career and sort of really planting those seeds and then giving them sort of real talk and guidance as to how they can look towards success in the law firm context. Now, LSI attendees are historically from underrepresented groups. And so it allows a bit of access that I think historically might not have been the case within the legal industry. Now, taking that then inward, it's also building your pipeline, right? So making sure that you are attracting diverse talent and not just looking towards the same traditional avenues by which we recruit. Now, this is the case with sort of any type of recruiting, but you might have a handful of schools that you prefer. You need to look beyond that. You need to look beyond just a certain type of experience. And so we have been looking into recruiting efforts for folks that are maybe perhaps served military service and took a break on their legal profession and then are entering back into the legal workforce, really looking for opportunities to create sort of access and involvement where maybe it's a little bit harder to come by. Now, pushing forward, we're also sort of taking a bit of a stronger stance and asking more of the law firms with whom we work. And so we've also sort of kicked off a pilot program with, say, the top 20 sort of law firms we do business with, having sort of set goals that we would like to see in terms of representation, not just on our cases, but sort of within the entire firm at large. But again, it's not sort of a set red line. If you cross it, you lose our business. It's a partnership. And so working with the firms when they are having trouble meeting those needs to give them suggestions as to what we think will work to help them improve diversity at the firm, both for sort of the near term and the longer term. So all said, my approach, I think, is pretty comprehensive. It requires collaboration, but it isn't just inward facing. It requires sort of, I think, investment just for our own department, but investment both with the firms we work with, as well as sort of law students as well.
Mm-hmm. And when you talk about that, you talk about working with your outside counsel toward goals. How do you feel about requirements, right? Something that's maybe a step further, given some of the blowback we've seen against other companies that have instituted some more stringent requirements. Like, where do you fall in terms of evaluating that sort of approach? And
sure, I think every company kind of picks sort of the right method for them. For Google specifically, we felt that having aspirational goals in which we are partnering with firms to give them solutions to meet those goals is a better collaborative effort. It allows us to build sort of sustainable, robust programs that aren't just about hitting a specific number. Now, for other companies, they're able to achieve sort of great impact, perhaps with requirements or not. But for us specifically, we've actually found that this is sort of a collaborative approach that gets us not just sort of the type of representation that we want to see, say, at the firm context, but also sort of allows our attorneys to sort of engage and support that method as well. It seems it's a little bit more to the spirit of how we operate.
Let's shift gears a little and touch on COVID. A lot of companies are perhaps moving into this hybrid workplace, a mashup from work from home or work from anywhere, and in office or desk hoteling. How do you guys think about return to work broadly, and what kinds of concerns do you have about this mashup world and its impact on DEI initiatives?
Yeah, so we recently announced kind of our foray into sort of what return to office looks like coming into the fall. And, fundamentally, it's a notion of a hybrid work week, right? Some days in the office, some without. And I think as it relates to DEI, I think it really hinges on inclusivity. How do you sort of create a work environment where no matter if you are working from home, if you are working in the office, that we are inclusive in terms of both the viewpoints expressed in a given meeting, but also in terms of access to career development, access to tools, mentoring, and the like, such that it is not hampered by you being in person or without. A lot of that work is ongoing now. I'm being very intentional about, we've gone completely from a sort of in-office sort of notion of support and career growth and decision-making to one that's gone almost entirely virtual. And so thinking through that notion of how do you take the best of both worlds and make that kind of a sustainable sort of operation over time. Now, this is probably the new norm, right? One particular country's return to office is unfortunately perhaps another company's lockdown, and we have to be flexible and understanding about that. And so it's an iterative process. I think we stay anchored to the notion of allowing for collaborative, facilitated decision making, but then also thinking about how we make sure that our employees feel not only valued, but impactful and included, no matter what their actual office sort of status is.
Do you have any tips for recipes to create that sort of inclusivity?
I would. So I think a lot of it goes to almost sort of, you almost have sort of a hit list. And if you're on a given call, sometimes you'll find that folks will hang back, particularly if they're virtual. They might actually be sort of taking it in. And I tend to find that this works if you're in person or not. Without putting people on the spot, take the time, particularly as a leader, to solicit viewpoints, to actually hold the space to get a point of view from the folks in the quote unquote virtual room. Now, leaders have to drive this. It shouldn't just be incumbent on the individual because they might not feel comfortable. And so really sort of making a call for that. Some of it is also basic good meeting hygiene. Two people speak at the same time. Perhaps the person in the room gets to it first because they're actually physically in the room, while as the person that's on, video conference feels the need to hang back. Remember that moment, return back to that person. So it really is sort of as sort of the lead in the room, almost acting like a producer. Have a high produced meeting and make sure that you are sort of tracking the interactions in the room and circling back. If there are conversations that are happening outside in the hallway, circling back via email to include all attendees so they're brought up to speed on what's happened.
Yeah, lawyers need a lot of people management skills right now, especially when they're in-house. One more question. I mean, I feel like we have all had a rough 14 or 15 months now, right? As general counsel, how do you counsel your stakeholders in a constant state of crisis?
A good sense of humor is always helpful, and some levity, right?
You are the most down to earth of general counsel, I have got to say.
I mean, I think it requires, when you lead in times of crisis, it requires you to sort of have an authentic and humbling acknowledgement of the circumstances in which you are operating in, right? And so recognize that everyone, no matter what their role is in a state of flux. And you have to be able to sort of navigate that ambiguity with grace, with calm. And when you can achieve calm, be honest about the chaos that exists, right? The sooner that you can do that, you sort of take kind of the pressure out of the room, and then you get down to business. To me, I think that's sort of what I anchor myself to throughout most of this crisis. And then when in doubt, a little humor doesn't hurt.
Exactly. We all need to be able to laugh at ourselves right now. Halimah, this has been great. The world is nuts right now, and we could go on chatting for hours, but we're out of time. So thank you so much for your advice and your insights. And with that, I'm handing things back over to Amanda.